I first met Sarah during my freshman year of college. We were both in the same intro-level psych class, sitting just a few seats apart, and our paths crossed during one of those icebreaker activities professors love so much. We had to partner up, ask a series of questions, and share the answers with the class. Sarah and I ended up as partners, and I remember being immediately struck by how easy she was to talk to. None of that awkward small talk that usually comes with meeting someone new. She was quick-witted, thoughtful, and seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. We clicked from that moment on. Over the next few weeks, we started spending more and more time together. We bonded over our shared interests, reading, binge-watching obscure documentaries, and spending hours discussing the nuances of various philosophical ideas, all while drowning ourselves in cheap coffee from the campus cafe. It didn't take long for Sarah to become my closest friend at school. I can't say there was anything particularly unusual about her at first. She seemed like a regular college student, just as overwhelmed by the workload, and just as eager to figure out what came next in life. One thing I noticed early on, though, was that Sarah didn't talk much about her family. She was pretty private about her personal life, and while she would share stories about high school or her childhood now and then, it was always surface-level stuff. The one family member she did mention regularly was her younger sister, Emma. From the way Sarah talked about her, it was clear they were close. She would light up whenever she mentioned Emma, describing her as this incredibly smart and talented kid who had always been her rock. Occasionally, she'd talk about her mom, but I never heard much about her dad or any other family. I didn't press her about it. I figured everyone had their boundaries, and I was fine letting Sarah open up at her own pace. As the years went by, Sarah and I stayed close. We both chose to stay on campus during breaks most of the time, so it felt like we were going through everything together. Stress from finals, trying to figure out internships, dealing with failed relationships. Sarah became more like family to me than just a friend. We moved into an off-campus apartment together during our junior year, and that's when I started to notice subtle changes in her behavior. It started with small things. Sarah, who used to be full of energy and ready to tackle the day, seemed tired all the time. She would complain about feeling fatigued or dizzy, but brush it off as stress or not getting enough sleep. At first, I didn't think much of it. Who among us wasn't tired in college, right? But as time went on, her complaints became more frequent. She'd skip meals because she wasn't feeling well, and her weight started to fluctuate. She'd go through periods where she'd lose a noticeable amount of weight, then gain it back quickly, only for the cycle to start again. Our friend group and I noticed. We'd offer advice, suggesting she see a doctor or try to get more rest. But Sarah always had an excuse. "It's just stress," she'd say. Or, "I've been swamped with work lately." Part of me believed her. College was stressful after all. But something didn't sit right. There were days when she would seem almost too tired to function. She'd cancel plans last minute because she wasn't feeling well, or would leave early from social events, claiming she just needed to lie down. By the time we graduated, Sarah's health had visibly deteriorated. She wasn't the same vibrant person I'd met in that psych class years ago. She was pale, constantly tired, and seemed to be battling a range of strange symptoms: fatigue, dizziness, digestive issues. And while she still claimed it was all due to stress or her busy schedule, I couldn't help but wonder if something else was going on. The turning point came a few months after graduation, when Sarah and I were still living together, both navigating the post-college life. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to find her standing by the sink, pale and shaky. She looked like she was on the verge of passing out. When I asked what was wrong, she mumbled something about feeling sick and needing to lie down, but I could see that her hands were trembling. I finally convinced her to sit down, and that's when she admitted she hadn't eaten anything substantial all day. Again, that's when it hit. This wasn't just about stress or fatigue. Something deeper was happening, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own life to see it clearly. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to Sarah's eating habits. At first, she would pick at food during meals or claim she wasn't hungry. Then I noticed patterns. She would go for long periods without eating, and when she did eat, it was often small portions of low-calorie foods. She avoided anything that had a significant amount of carbs or fat, and she always seemed to have an excuse for why she couldn't eat more. It was as if she was rationing her food in a way that didn't make sense. I tried talking to her about it, but Sarah was adamant that everything was fine. She insisted that she was eating enough and that her symptoms were due to other factors: stress, lack of sleep, maybe even a sensitivity to certain foods. But the more I paid attention, the more obvious it became that she was in denial. Our other friends noticed too. We would have dinners together, and Sarah would pick at her food, pushing it around her plate without actually eating much of it. She always had an excuse ready. She wasn't feeling well, or she'd eaten a big lunch earlier, or she wasn't in the mood for that particular dish. We didn't know what to do. It's not easy to confront someone about their eating habits, especially when they're your best friend. None of us wanted to believe that Sarah might be dealing with something as serious as an eating disorder, but the signs were becoming harder to ignore. The breaking point came one night when Sarah fainted in our apartment. We were watching a movie, and she had been quiet for most of the evening. Out of nowhere, she slumped over on the couch, completely unresponsive. I panicked, shaking her, calling her name, but she didn't wake up for what felt like an eternity. When she finally came to, she was disoriented, claiming she just needed some water and rest. I wasn't having it. I told her she needed to see a doctor immediately. There was no more brushing this off. Something was seriously wrong, and I wasn't going to let her continue ignoring it. That night marked the beginning of a long, difficult road. After that night, when Sarah fainted in our apartment, I knew we had to dig deeper into what was really going on. At first, she was reluctant to open up. She hated the idea of being seen as a problem, as someone who needed fixing. But after years of being so close, she could tell I wasn't going to let this slide. We'd shared too much of our lives for me to sit back and watch her deteriorate without doing something about it. Little by little, she began to open up, peeling back the layers of her life that she had always kept hidden. The more she shared, the more I realized that her issues weren't just about food or stress. They went much deeper. Sarah grew up in what she described as a covertly abusive household, a place where everything seemed fine on the surface, but underneath was a mess of dysfunction and emotional manipulation. Her father, as it turned out, was a big part of that. On paper, he was a successful man, earning a significant salary that should have provided a comfortable life for the family. But in reality, he never took care of them financially. Instead, he gambled away most of his money or spent it on flashy luxuries that served no real purpose, leaving Sarah's mother and 5 children scrambling to make ends meet. The house was always full of tension, Sarah told me. Money was tight, and her father's selfishness created a toxic atmosphere. He wasn't physically abusive, but there was this emotional neglect that wore everyone down over time, a kind of silent cruelty that Sarah didn't fully understand until she was older. Her mother, on the other hand, was a victim of her father's manipulation. She had been beaten down by years of emotional control and gaslighting, and it became clear that her mother was living in a constant state of anxiety. What really hit me, though, was when Sarah started talking about food. Her mother had an eating disorder, too. Something she didn't even recognize herself. Sarah described how her mother would skip meals, obsess over calorie counting, and send the kids to school with barely enough food to get through the day. "I remember being in elementary school," Sarah said one night, her voice low as she stared into her tea. "My lunch would be a handful of baby carrots, maybe a few bell pepper slices, and a tiny bag of chips. That's it. And the thing is, my mom thought that was normal. She thought that was enough because it's what she ate. I didn't even realize that it wasn't normal until I got older. I just figured everyone else must have been overeating because their lunches were always so much bigger." It started to make sense, why Sarah's eating habits had always seemed off, why she was so secretive about her health. Her relationship with food had been warped from an early age. Growing up, meals weren't just a way to nourish the body. They were a source of control, of scarcity, and of survival. Her mother had internalized this idea that less food equaled more control, and in a house where control was constantly slipping through everyone's fingers, this was something she could grasp tightly. Sarah told me that her mom would go through phases where she would barely eat anything, surviving on a few bites here and there. Her mother believed this was healthy, that she was being disciplined. She never saw it as an issue. It was just the way things were. And naturally, Sarah and her siblings picked up on it, thinking that eating the same way would make them stronger. They didn't realize it was the opposite, that their bodies were starving, that their minds were being conditioned to associate food with shame. As Sarah spoke, I started to see the connections between her childhood and the woman sitting in front of a friend I thought I knew so well. She had carried these distorted beliefs about food into adulthood, internalizing the same unhealthy habits she learned from her mother. She never felt like she was starving herself because, to her, this was just normal. Her mom did it. Her siblings did it, and it seemed like the way to live. But as Sarah's health deteriorated, those childhood coping mechanisms weren't enough anymore. Her body was crying out for nourishment, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. That's when the symptoms started. Chronic fatigue, dizziness, digestive problems. Her body was breaking down, and it had been for years. But the scariest part was that Sarah couldn't even see it. In her mind, she was just doing what she'd always done, trying to stay in control. I remember one night in particular when we were sitting on the couch, Sarah's hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her face pale and gaunt in the dim light. "I used to think my mom was invincible," she said softly. "She would talk about how strong she was, how she didn't need food the way other people did, and I wanted to be just like her. I thought that if I could just eat less, be more disciplined, I'd be stronger too. But now—" She trailed off, staring into the mug as if searching for answers in the swirling steam. I didn't know what to say. How do you respond to that? How do you comfort someone who has spent their entire life battling a monster they didn't even know existed? It took a while, but Sarah eventually agreed to get help. I think part of her knew that she couldn't keep going the way she had been. Her body was giving up, and she had to face the reality that she was struggling with an eating disorder. We found a therapist who specialized in disordered eating, and Sarah started attending sessions regularly. At first, it was hard for her to admit that she needed help, that her relationship with food wasn't healthy. But over time, she began to make progress. It wasn't an easy road. There were days when Sarah would backslide, falling into old habits or pushing herself too hard. But the more she talked about her past, the more she understood how deeply those childhood experiences had shaped her. She wasn't just dealing with an eating disorder. She was untangling years of trauma, of emotional neglect, of learned behaviors that had been ingrained in her from a young age. I remember one breakthrough moment in particular. We were sitting in the kitchen, and Sarah was making herself a sandwich. A simple act, but one that had been loaded with so much fear and anxiety. She paused, looking at the bread, the deli meat, the cheese, and then at me. "It's weird," she said quietly. "I never realized how much of my life was wrapped up in food. It's like everything I did, everything I felt, somehow came back to it." She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she spread mustard onto the bread. "But I'm tired of being afraid," she said. "I'm tired of letting this control me." And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. As Sarah continued to unpack her past, the picture of her childhood became even clearer and more heartbreaking. The food insecurity in her household was constant, even though it shouldn't have been. Once Sarah and her siblings were old enough to work, they each found part-time jobs, and it wasn't to save up for new clothes or college funds like most teenagers. No, they worked to buy their own food. Sarah described how she and her siblings would carefully portion out their paychecks, setting aside money for groceries and sneaking food into their rooms, hiding it away to keep it safe from each other. In a house where there was never enough to go around, they all had to fend for themselves. It wasn't just about hunger, it was about survival. Each kid learned quickly that if they didn't stash away food, someone else might eat it before they had a chance. The cupboards were always sparse, and Sarah's father wasn't going to spend his money on anything practical. Her father's paycheck may have been enough to provide for the family, but between his gambling and frivolous spending, there was never enough for the essentials. He didn't see food as a priority, and neither did Sarah's mother, who still believed that eating less was somehow a sign of strength. The only way Sarah could escape the constant gnawing hunger was to make sure she had something of her own. But it wasn't just about scarcity. It was about control. The household was full of constant commentary on what foods were healthy and what weren't. Sarah's mother had a strict, warped view of food, and that view seeped into every corner of their lives. The pressure to eat the right things only added to the confusion, especially when the right things meant barely eating anything at all. This toxic environment shaped Sarah's relationship with food in ways that would take years to unravel. She grew up genuinely believing that as long as you ate something every day, you weren't starving yourself. But the reality was far more dangerous. In her case, that something was often as little as half an apple or a handful of tortilla chips, especially when she was under stress. For years, she thought this was normal. She had never known anything different, and no one in her family questioned it. Food was something you had to control, something you rationed, not something to enjoy or nourish yourself. It wasn't until much later, 2021 to be exact, that Sarah began to fully realize how distorted her views on food and health were. That realization didn't come easy. It took years of small moments, like the night she fainted in our apartment, for her to start acknowledging that something was deeply wrong. Even as her body screamed for help, her mind fought back, insisting that she was fine, that she was just following the habits she'd been taught. It wasn't until she started therapy that Sarah began to piece together the true depth of her relationship with food. The therapist helped her see how deeply her childhood had shaped her. Those years of hiding food, rationing meals, and feeling guilty for eating too much had left a lasting impact. Sarah had spent her entire life battling invisible rules about food, rules that weren't hers, but ones she had inherited from her parents. Sarah's sessions in therapy weren't just about food. They were about unlearning the lies she had been told as a child. She had to confront the reality that her father's neglect and her mother's disordered eating had shaped not only how she viewed food, but also how she viewed herself. She realized that her sense of self-worth had always been tied to how little she could eat, how much she could control her body. And when her body started to fail her, it felt like she was failing too. In 2021, something shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment or an epiphany, but a gradual understanding that the way she had been living, starving herself, rationing food, wasn't sustainable. Sarah told me about a day that had stuck in her mind, a simple moment that seemed insignificant at the time. She had been at the grocery store, standing in the produce aisle, staring at a bag of apples. Normally, she would have grabbed one or two, enough to last her for a week. But that day, something clicked. She realized she didn't have to live that way anymore. She could buy more. She could allow herself to eat until she was full. It sounds small, but for Sarah, that was a monumental step. She had spent so much of her life living in fear of food, afraid that if she ate too much, she would lose control. But on that day, standing in the grocery store, she chose to buy a whole bag of apples. It wasn't a cure, not by any means, but it was the beginning of her reclaiming her relationship with food. From there, things didn't magically get better, but Sarah started making more of those small, intentional decisions. She began listening to her body more, trying to unlearn the habits that had been ingrained in her for so long. Therapy helped, and so did the support of her friends, but it was Sarah's determination that really made the difference. She was tired of living in fear, tired of the constant battle with food, with her own body. Over time, Sarah began to open up more about her past, even to people outside of her immediate circle. She told me that one of the hardest parts was acknowledging that her childhood hadn't been as normal as she'd once thought. It wasn't until she started seeing her family through a different lens that she realized how much damage had been done. The control her parents had exerted over her life, over her body, her mind, her sense of self-worth, was something she hadn't fully understood until she stepped away. The toughest part for Sarah was forgiving herself. For years, she had blamed herself for being weak when she couldn't stick to her restrictive eating habits, for feeling hungry when she thought she shouldn't, for being tired when her body was starving. She had to learn to forgive herself for the mistakes that weren't hers to begin with. It was a slow process, but day by day, Sarah was starting to heal. Our conversations grew deeper during this time. Sarah wasn't just my best friend anymore. She was someone I admired deep. Watching her confront her past, face her trauma, and work towards healing was incredible. I learned so much from her about resilience, about how the things we experience as children can shape us in ways we don't fully understand until much later in life. I watched Sarah change in ways I never expected. She started taking better care of herself, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally too. She began to rediscover who she was outside of the food, the rules, the control. And while it wasn't a linear journey, it was a powerful. For the first time, Sarah was learning how to live without fear. It was a long road, but by the end of 2021, Sarah was in a better place than I had ever seen her. She was eating more regularly, taking care of her health, and working through the emotional baggage she had carried for so long. We both knew there was still a lot of work to be done, but it was the first time I felt hopeful for her future. And for Sarah, it was the first time she felt hopeful for herself. Since that pivotal moment in 2021, Sarah has made incredible strides toward recovery. It wasn't an overnight transformation. In fact, it was a long, slow process that tested her patience and resolve in ways I can hardly imagine. But through it all, she remained committed to changing the way she thought about food, about her body, and about her own self-worth. The first major step was continuing therapy. She had already been working with her therapist for some time, but after opening up about her childhood, they were able to dig even deeper into the harmful beliefs that had been ingrained in her from such a young age. It wasn't just about what she was eating or how much. It was about unlearning everything she had internalized growing up in a household where control over food equaled control over life. Sarah told me there were days when she felt like she was unraveling a tangled mess of thoughts and feelings that had been buried for years. But with every session, she got a little closer to understanding herself and, more importantly, to forgiving herself. At the same time, she started working with a nutritionist, someone who helped her reframe the way she looked at food entirely. Sarah had spent her entire life seeing food as the enemy, something to be rationed, feared, controlled. But through nutritional education, she learned that food wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something that could nourish her, make her stronger, help her heal. It took time for her to fully accept this. For so long, food had been a source of guilt and anxiety. And letting go of that was one of the hardest things she had to do. But the more she learned, the more she realized how problematic her old habits were, not just for her, but for her mother as well. This was one of the most eye-opening parts of Sarah's journey, recognizing that her mother had been trapped in the same destructive patterns. For so long, Sarah had seen her mother's eating habits as normal, even admirable in some twisted way. But with the help of her therapist and nutritionist, she came to understand that her mother's disordered eating wasn't something to emulate. It was something to break free from. It was a tough realization. As much as Sarah loved her mother, she now saw how deeply her mother's issues had affected her and her siblings, how those patterns of scarcity and control had been passed down like a legacy. And for Sarah, breaking that cycle became one of the most important parts of her recovery. But recovery wasn't linear. There were days when Sarah still struggled, when the old habits and thoughts crept back in. There were moments when she found herself slipping into those familiar patterns of restriction and guilt, especially during times of stress. But she didn't face those battles alone. In 2022, she made the decision to join Eating Disorders Anonymous, EDA, a support group that provided her with a sense of community and accountability that she hadn't realized she needed. EDA was a game-changer for Sarah. Up until then, she had always felt like she was fighting her demons in isolation, even with therapy and nutritional education. But joining a group of people who understood what she was going through, who could relate to her struggles in a way that no one else could, made all the difference. It gave her a space to talk openly about her fears, her setbacks, and her victories, and to hear from others who were on similar journeys. It wasn't just about sharing stories, it was about finding strength in numbers, about realizing that she wasn't alone in this fight. Sarah started attending weekly meetings, and while it wasn't always easy, the support she found there helped her stay on track. There were times when she felt like giving up, when the old thoughts and patterns seemed too ingrained to break. But being part of EDA gave her a sense of responsibility, not just to herself, but to the people in her group. They held each other accountable, celebrated each other's progress, and picked each other up when things got tough. Watching Sarah grow and reclaim her health over the past few years has been one of the most inspiring things I've ever witnessed. I've seen her go from someone who was too afraid to eat, who saw food as the enemy, to someone who is learning to embrace nourishment, to take care of her body, and to love herself in a way she never thought possible. The transformation hasn't been easy, and it's far from over, but she's come so far from where she started. Last year, we sat down for a meal together, a simple dinner at a local restaurant. It might not seem like a big deal, but for Sarah, it was a monumental step. We ordered appetizers, entrees, and dessert, and for the first time in a long time, I saw Sarah eat without hesitation, without guilt. She didn't push her food around her plate. She didn't make excuses about why she couldn't finish. She just ate, like any other person would. It was a moment of quiet victory, one that felt like the culmination of years of hard work, of therapy, of support groups, of small, everyday decisions that added up to something bigger than either of us could have imagined. Of course, Sarah still has her bad days. Recovery isn't a straight line, and there are times when she has to remind herself of all the progress she's made. But even on those bad days, she's stronger now. She knows how to reach out for help when she needs it, and she has the tools to navigate those moments without letting them drag her back down. She's built a support system, Through therapy, through EDA, through her friends, and she's learned how to lean on it when the weight of her past feels too heavy to carry on her own. I'm proud of Sarah, more than I can put into words. She's faced battles that most people can't even imagine, and she's come out the other side stronger, healthier, and more determined than ever. Her journey isn't over, and I don't think it ever will be. Recovery, after all, is a lifelong process, but watching her fight for her health, for her future, has been nothing short of incredible. It's been an honor to stand by her side through it all, to be there for the highs and the lows, and to watch her become the person she was always meant to be. Sarah has taught me so much about resilience, about what it means to fight for yourself, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Her strength, her courage, her willingness to confront the darkest parts of her past, it's all inspired me in ways I never expected. She's not just my best friend anymore, she's my hero.